Taylor Jo, what is universal basic income and how does it relate to the broader conversation on poverty?
Yeah, so I first want to say thank you to the Bush Center for having us. It's exciting to be able to have this conversation in this space, and in follow-up to the stellar panelists we just heard. I have to say it's probably one of the most intimidating professional moments ever to talk about the economy after former Treasury Secretary and Chair of the Federal Reserve, but I'll give it a go. Universal basic income is universal, unconditional, reoccurring cash stipends for all individuals in a geographical area. So I'm going to break that down, I think, throughout our conversation, because actually we are in a moment where this term universal basic income is actually used to describe a few different policy interventions, which I'm excited to talk a little bit about. But I think it's worth taking a step back and contextualizing the moment that we're in and why this idea has all of a sudden gained some additional traction and interest across the country. I think our last panel did a fantastic job of teeing up where the economy is at, but I actually want to take it from some of the big macro trends that we're seeing and talk about it in terms of lived experience of people on the ground. So, a few things that I think really highlight how we think about this and how we contextualize in our examination of a basic income in this moment. So the first is this question around automation. How is it impacting jobs? How do people experience that? How does it change their day-to-day in the workplace? One of the things that we take note of is the fact that since 2005, 94% of the jobs that have been created are contingent or part-time work, which is a different economy and a different experience for the average worker. We also know that over 50% of Americans can't pull together $400 in emergency. So a car breaks down, their kid gets sick, and they don't have health care. Any American hits that experience of not having that $400 and puts them on a pathway into poverty. We also know that over 50% of Americans will experience at least 1 year below the poverty rate in this country. So there's a few of these trends that we're seeing, partially from automation, partially from entrenched poverty that has existed in this country and hasn't really budged in the past 40 years, and then also inequality. And I think there's a lot of numbers and trends that we hear a lot about in terms of concentration of wealth, who's benefiting from our economic growth, which we heard some great comments on what inclusive growth could look like. And so all of these things are happening, which is fermenting a particular feeling in the country right now. So why has universal basic income become like such a hot button topic? So I think a few things. One is Silicon Valley really grabbed it and ran with it in the context of the artificial intelligence and automation conversation. I think the second piece of this is that post the most recent election cycle, people realized there was a disconnect between the conversation we were having as a country and the actual lived experience of people on the ground. And so people realized that we need to start looking to some big ideas to really reflect people's pain and also attempts to grapple with some of this disconnect between people's inability to make ends meet with where the economy, this conversation around a growing and thriving economy. But I think the other piece of this is that this idea actually isn't new, and I think that's a really important thing to note. This is, I would say, probably the second wave of big interest in the United States back in the 1960s and 1970s. MLK was a huge champion of this idea of guaranteed income. Milton Friedman championed a version called the negative income tax. There was something called the Family Assistance Plan under the Nixon administration that almost came to be. So when people started saying, okay, what ideas can we look at? I think people who started digging in realized, wait, this almost came to fruition. In fact, the Earned Income Tax Credit, our most effective anti-poverty intervention, came out of that conversation. And so people are saying that this isn't necessarily a new thing, so it's not totally crazy. So let's maybe try it out and talk about it. I think you might disagree with me on that a little bit. But we also know that the foundation of this idea is based on a robust evidence base. So for those of you who follow the international development conversation, cash stipends and cash transfers are not a new idea and in fact experienced a real revolution for the past decade, largely led by a nonprofit called Give Directly, has done a ton of randomized control trials to say, what does it look like when you just give people money, right? And in those cases, here in the United States, we've seen in past experiments that education outcomes improve, health outcomes improve, people don't stop working overall, which is always the thing that people grasp onto with this idea. We have evidence from that from a set of income experiments in the 1970s. There was the Mincome experiments in Canada, We had the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which is a version of a basic income to turn to for evidence. So we know we're not basing this off of just a whim or kind of a philosophical idea, that there is evidence out there around cash as an intervention in terms of providing economic stability for individuals and families. So there's so much more to discuss, and I wanted to get in conversation, but I think the last thing I would just quickly note before we move forward is that people get attracted to basic income because it's supposedly a very simple idea, but I would say that's exactly not the case. The complexity of this idea lives in how you implement it question, in terms of how do you pay for it? Is it actually universal? Is that the best way to go about it? What could disqualify someone from a basic income? And does it actually tackle the right problem? And that's something that my organization, we spend a lot of time researching, exploring, talking to experts about, and I'm excited to bring that conversation into the room here.